In June 1941, during the first weeks of the war on the Eastern Front, German units in one sector near Rasenii ran into a situation they did not expect. A single Soviet KV-1 heavy tank took up position on a road near marshland and effectively blocked movement along a key route. Getting around it was extremely difficult. The terrain made it hard to quickly change course. Attempts to destroy the tank with anti-tank artillery failed. According to German reports, the hits left little more than dents in the armor. When a more powerful gun was brought up, the tank managed to open fire first. Demolition attempts also failed to solve the problem immediately. In German documents, this tank was described as a monster. And that was not just frontline exaggeration. In one specific sector, a single KV-1 disrupted supply lines for an extended period, delayed troop movement, and forced the enemy to urgently change its tactical plans. This episode became one of the most famous in the history of Soviet heavy tanks. But its importance goes beyond the incident itself. It shows the kind of impression the KV made in the opening phase of the war, and why its appearance became a serious battlefield factor. At the start of the war, the Soviet Union was the only country with a significant number of heavy tanks featuring true shell-resistant armor. The KV had been designed as a breakthrough tank, meant to operate where lighter vehicles quickly lost effectiveness under fire. In terms of protection, it truly stood out compared to most tanks of its time. But the KV's later history turned out to be far more complex than its most famous combat episodes might suggest. Why did a tank that was considered one of the strongest in the world in 1941 fail to become a universal answer for the front? Why were so many of these machines lost not in direct combat with the enemy? What problems emerged in real-world service? And how did the appearance of the German Tiger change the KV's place on the battlefield? In this video, we will walk step by step through the history of the KV tank, from its creation and first combat trials to its best-known battlefield episodes, later upgrades, and gradual move out of the frontline spotlight. By the end, it will be clear what the KV's real strength was, where its limitations lay, and what place it ultimately holds in the history of the war and the development of Soviet armored forces. In the second half of the 1930s, tank design in many countries ran into the same problem. Tanks were getting faster, more complex, and better armed, but their protection often remained too weak. On the battlefield, this led to one simple and unpleasant reality. Even a well-armed tank could be stopped by relatively light anti-tank weapons. Armor that was supposed to protect the crew and keep the vehicle moving was often penetrated in situations where far more was expected of it. It was against this backdrop that the Soviet Union began looking for a different approach to the heavy tank. What was needed was not just a machine that looked intimidating, but one that could actually take hits and remain combat-capable under heavy fire. This was no longer about modest improvements in protection, but a shift to a new doctrine. A heavy tank had to keep advancing where lighter vehicles quickly lost their advantage. That is how the KV emerged, a tank that, from the very beginning, was conceived as an answer to the main vulnerability of armored vehicles of that era. Its development in 1939 was tied to a design team led by Joseph Yakovlevich Kotin. This was not a Sluchany prototype or a stopgap design, but the result of a very specific requirement. Give the army a heavy tank with truly serious armor and sufficient firepower. By design, the KV-1 combined qualities that were rarely achieved together at the time. It had a 76mm gun, capable of engaging a wide range of targets with confidence, and several machine guns for close-in defense. A 5-man crew allowed tasks inside the vehicle to be divided properly: command, aiming, loading, driving, and operating the hull-mounted armament. For a heavy tank, this was especially important, because overloading even one crew member in combat almost always reduced the effectiveness of the entire vehicle. But the most important thing about the KV-1 was not just its weapons or even its specifications taken on their own. What mattered most was that it was designed from the outset as a tank able to survive what was critical for most vehicles of that period. That was its fundamental difference. While much of the world's armored forces remained vulnerable to anti-tank artillery, Soviet designers were trying to build a machine that changed the very nature of the encounter with that threat. On paper, it looked like a bold and very expensive step. In reality, however, decisions like this always go through the same final test: war. Only there does it become clear where a design concept truly works, and where its strengths turn out to be less straightforward than they seemed. For the KV, that moment came very quickly. The real test began under conditions where armored vehicles were expected not so much to fight maneuvering tank duels, as to literally carve a path through fortified defenses. The Soviet-Finnish War became the first real trial for the new heavy tanks, and it was there that it became clear the KV concept had not appeared by accident. Several promising heavy prototypes were sent to the front at once. Alongside the KV, the multi-turreted SMK and T-100 were also tested while serving with the 20th Tank Brigade. This was an important moment. The military and the designers were effectively comparing different paths for heavy tank development, not on a proving ground, but in actual combat. Theory met practice directly, with no allowances. Tank versus tank clashes were relatively rare in that campaign, so the newest vehicles had little chance to prove themselves in duels against enemy armor. But something else became clear very quickly. In operations to break through fortified positions, such machines were especially valuable. Wherever crews had to advance under fire, engage protected positions, and keep moving, the advantages of a heavy tank stood out far more clearly than in any training exercise. The KV-1 demonstrated exactly what it had been built for. It could withstand hits from anti-tank guns that would have been extremely dangerous for many tanks of that era. That changed the feel of combat for both the crew and the command. The vehicle could keep operating where more vulnerable armor quickly lost momentum or was knocked out. In an assault on a fortified line, this was not just a convenience, it was a factor that directly affected the success of the attack. But along with its strengths, the limits of the basic version also became apparent almost immediately. The 76mm gun, while suitable for a wide range of tasks, was not always effective enough against permanent fortifications. Strong points and bunkers required a more powerful weapon. This was an important lesson. The tank itself, as a platform, showed high potential, but its armament for this specific mission already needed to be strengthened. That is why, even during the war, work began on a version with an enlarged turret and a 152mm howitzer, the future KV-2. This decision did not come from an abstract desire to simply make it more powerful, but from direct combat experience. The vehicle needed not only to survive incoming fire, but also to reliably destroy fortified positions that were slowing the advance. At the same time, combat trials produced another major conclusion, one that affected the entire Soviet school of heavy tank design. Multi-turret tanks, which had previously seemed like an impressive direction, proved in practice to be too complex, too expensive, and too difficult to operate effectively. The concept looked impressive, but in real war that complexity did not deliver the expected advantage. Against that backdrop, the KV looked far more rational. One turret, a clear layout, strong protection, and real battlefield utility. After the Finnish campaign, the question was no longer which heavy tank to choose from several competing concepts. In essence, the choice had already been made. The KV stopped being just an experimental vehicle and became the foundation of a direction the Soviet military was now betting on seriously. And that meant an entirely different exam lay ahead, a much larger war, where the true significance of such machines would be tested in full. By the summer of 1941, the KV was no longer seen as a successful prototype, but as a real combat asset, one that carried serious expectations. Compared with most heavy tanks of that period, it looked exceptionally strong. The combination of heavy protection and serious firepower made it one of the most formidable vehicles in its class, and that is not an exaggeration. By that point, the Soviet Union was in a unique position. No other country had heavy tanks with shell-resistant armor in such numbers. The scale itself also mattered. As of early June 1941, Red Army units had 412 KV-1 tanks in service. For a new heavy tank, that was a substantial number, especially considering how difficult such machines were to produce. But behind that impressive figure was a problem that would become very visible later. The tanks were distributed unevenly across the troops. In some sectors, their presence significantly strengthened a formation. In others, they were scarce, and the tank's overall potential could not be fully realized. This is where an important contrast appears. one that is often lost when people focus only on specifications. The KV itself was a very powerful tank, but war judges not an individual vehicle, but an entire system, where it is deployed, how quickly it is supplied, who operates it, what condition it is in when it reaches combat, and how it is used in a specific situation. So even having hundreds of KVs did not mean the front would feel the same effect from them everywhere. Even so, where a KV appeared at the right time and in the right place, the impression it made was extremely strong. For German units, encountering such a tank in the first weeks of the war could be an unpleasant surprise. Standard anti-tank weapons did not always produce the expected result, and the normal logic of the fight was disrupted. A tank that should have been stopped relatively quickly kept moving and remained combat capable. In moments like that, the KV began to be seen not just as a heavy tank, but as an almost invulnerable obstacle. That reputation did not come from propaganda descriptions, but from real combat experience in the first days of the war. The KV made a powerful impression not only because of its armor, but because of the simple fact that it was there at a critical point. It could sharply complicate enemy operations, delay an advance, break the usual tempo of an offensive, and force the enemy to look for unconventional solutions. For early war armored warfare, that was a rare quality. But that very image, a machine that seemed to have almost no counter, also set the stage for one of the most famous episodes in the KV's history. Soon, an incident would occur that showed better than any comparison both the capabilities of this tank and the kind of effect a single crew could create across an entire sector of the front. In June 1941, near Rasenii, an episode took place that would long cement the KV's reputation as a machine capable of wrecking the plans of a much larger formation all by itself. This was not a neat training ground example or a convenient poster legend, but an extremely harsh combat situation in which a single tank ended up at a point where, suddenly, far too much depended on it. A KV from the Soviet 2nd Tank Division took up a position on a road near a marshy stretch of ground. According to one version of events, the vehicle was nearly out of fuel by then, and the crew effectively turned a forced stop into a defensive position. The location proved ideal. Bypassing the tank was almost impossible. The surrounding terrain was boggy, and the road itself remained a key route for movement. As a result, one tank did more than delay a column. It disrupted supply, evacuation, and the normal functioning of German units in that sector. The situation quickly went beyond an ordinary tactical problem. German records show how serious it became. The vehicle could not be bypassed, ammunition deliveries were hampered, and evacuating the wounded was nearly brought to a halt. What might have been resolved much faster under different circumstances turned here into an exhausting fight over a single point on the road. The first response was to try to suppress the KV with anti-tank artillery fire. A 50mm battery engaged it from about 500 meters, but the outcome was severe for the gun crews themselves. The Germans took losses in both guns and men, while the tank remained in action. The hits failed to produce the needed effect, and it became clear that the problem would not be solved by ordinary means. What followed were further attempts, each revealing the same issue. The KV could endure exactly the kind of punishment normally expected to stop a tank in combat. When the Germans brought up an 88mm gun and began moving it into position from roughly 700 meters, the KV crew did not allow the gun team to fully deploy and destroyed the weapon before it could change the situation. After that, they tried combat engineers. Demolition seemed like a logical idea, but the charges were not sufficient to reliably knock out such a heavy vehicle, especially given the size and toughness of its running gear. At this stage, the story of the KV at Rasenii turned into a duel not only of machines, but of decisions. The German side had to abandon straightforward attacks and switch to a more complex plan. According to memoirs and documents, a diversionary attack was organized. Several dozen tanks simulated pressure from different directions to force the KV crew to watch threats from the front and flanks. Under that cover, an 88mm gun was moved into place and concealed to the rear, where the chance of a kill was highest. Only then did they achieve a result. Several accurate hits penetrated the armor, and the tank was put out of action. Even for the enemy, this was no ordinary incident. By that point, the vehicle had already absorbed numerous hits, disrupted the work of entire units, and vividly demonstrated how difficult to target a heavily armored tank could be when it held a good position and was handled decisively. But in this very story, the one that made the KV a symbol of toughness, there was also an important contrast that foreshadowed its later fate. In battle, it could look almost impossible to overcome. And yet, most of these tanks were lost in completely different circumstances, without such duels, without dramatic episodes, and without the kind of effect left behind by the tank at Raseiniai. And this was the KV's central paradox. A machine capable of surviving intense fire and turning a narrow sector of the front into a problem for an entire division often proved vulnerable in everyday wartime reality, but not where people expected. The reasons were not only enemy action, but also the way a heavy tank existed outside the ideal combat episode, on the march, in the supply chain, in repair, and in the simple attempt to reach the right place on time. On paper, heavy armor and substantial weight looked like obvious advantages. In practice, that same weight, the source of the KV's toughness, created a whole chain of difficulties. It put heavy strain on the running gear, required careful operation and good maintenance, and in the conditions of the early war years, that was far from always possible. The front was moving fast, the situation changed abruptly, repair capabilities were limited, and vehicles were often pushed to their limits. Another problem made things worse, one without which a heavy tank could become little more than a stationary target: fuel. Under disrupted supply conditions, even a fully functional vehicle lost much of its value if it could not keep moving. For the KV, this was especially critical. Its weight and operating profile made fuel not just an important issue, but a decisive one. That is why a significant number of these tanks were lost, not in direct clashes with German tanks or artillery, but because of breakdowns and fuel shortages. This outcome often looked especially bitter. A machine that the enemy struggled to destroy in combat could end up being abandoned by its own crew after a technical failure or a halt on the march. That did not cancel out its combat qualities, but it dramatically changed the overall assessment. War demanded not only durability under fire, but also reliability and prolonged use. The ability to cover long distances, preserve mechanical life, and function within a supply system without constant disruption. This is where the difference between the KV and the T-34 became especially clear. With broadly similar main armament, the heavy tank had the advantage in protection, but lagged in speed and maneuverability. For certain combat tasks, that could be accepted as a reasonable price for heavier armor. But on the scale of an entire campaign, where vehicles had to do more than survive hits, where they had to move constantly, enter combat quickly, and be serviced with relative ease, those differences became more and more significant. The problems also showed up in infrastructure. The heavy vehicle chewed up roads, and many bridges simply were not built for that kind of weight. This limited movement routes, complicated redeployment, and made the KV's use dependent not only on the tactical situation, but on terrain and local infrastructure. As a result, a tank designed as a breakthrough and reinforcement weapon often required special conditions just to be used effectively. That is why the story of the KV is not only a story of thick armor and famous battlefield episodes, but also a story of a difficult compromise. Its strengths were undeniable, but the price of those strengths proved too high in real frontline service. Soviet commanders and designers had to find a way to preserve the tank's combat value without losing it altogether to technical and operational limitations. That is how the transition gradually matured toward a version intended to make the KV more mobile and practical, even if that meant sacrificing some protection. By 1942, it had become clear that keeping the KV in service in its original form would only get harder. Its strengths were still valued, but frontline experience had shown all too clearly that heavy armor alone was no longer enough. The tank needed a redesign that would let it operate faster, more simply, and more confidently in constantly changing battlefield conditions. That was the beginning of the modernized version known as the KV-1S, the S standing for Skorostnoy, or high speed. The name captured the idea behind the changes. This was not about designing a completely new tank from scratch. The goal was different: keep the core of the vehicle, but make it more mobile and easier to use in combat. To do that, the designers had to take a painful but unavoidable step: reduce its weight. The tank's mass was cut from about 47 tons to roughly 42.5 tons, and there was no way to achieve that without serious trade-offs. The main weight savings came from reducing the thickness of the hull armor plates and redesigning the turret. The turret became smaller, changed noticeably in appearance, and was made as a cast structure. One important improvement was the addition of a commander's cupola, which significantly improved visibility and battlefield control. For a heavy tank, this mattered a lot. The better the commander can see the battlefield, the faster the crew can react to threats, and the more effectively the tank can be used. At the same time, the armament remained broadly at the same level as the original KV-1. In terms of firepower, it was still a familiar platform, but in motion, it felt like a different machine. The reduced weight improved speed and maneuverability, and that directly affected survivability in real combat. It could change position faster, handle difficult terrain more easily, and was less constrained by route limitations. But the gain in mobility came at an obvious price. Thinner armor meant giving up some of the very protection that had once made the KV almost a symbol of the Soviet heavy tank. If the early versions impressed people above all by their ability to absorb heavy fire, the KV-1S was now a compromise variant, where the designers were effectively rebalancing priorities. This was not a rejection of the KV concept, but an attempt to adapt it to the new realities of war. At the same time, efforts were underway to improve its firepower. A more powerful 85mm gun was considered, and an experimental version with that weapon was in fact built. It showed the direction Soviet designers were moving in. A heavy tank had to retain acceptable mobility, while also gaining a gun capable of dealing confidently with increasingly well-protected targets. However, that version did not enter mass production. Further development led to the KV-85, a vehicle that stood on the boundary between the earlier KV concept and the next stage of Soviet heavy tank design. But it did not become a mass-produced tank either. By that point, industrial and military priorities were shifting toward the new IS family of heavy tanks, which better matched the changing demands of the front. It is telling that troops gave the KV-1S the unofficial nickname Kvasok, roughly Little Kvas. The nickname carries a frontline tone, a bit of irony, a bit of familiarity, and that soldier's habit of giving everyday names to the machines they had to live and work with. And that detail says a lot about this stage of the KV's story. The KV was still an important vehicle, but it was already clear that its era was reaching a turning point. While the designers were trying to make it faster and more practical, a new enemy had appeared on the battlefield, one that changed the very meaning of what counted as enough protection for a heavy tank. While the Soviet side was trying to make the KV more mobile and better suited to real frontline conditions, the enemy fielded a heavy tank that sharply changed the balance in this class. In late 1942, the German Tiger entered the battlefield, and its appearance marked a turning point, after which the KV's earlier advantages no longer looked absolute. Up to that point, the KV could remain an extremely difficult target for most German anti-tank weapons, especially when it held a good position and was handled well by its crew. But the Tiger was built as a vehicle representing a different level of threat. Its long-barreled 88mm gun allowed it to engage effectively at longer ranges, where the KV lost much of its advantage. If thick armor had previously given the Soviet heavy tank an important margin of survivability, it no longer guaranteed the same toughness. This was an especially unpleasant development for a machine whose reputation had been built around protection. The KV could still be dangerous in combat, but now it increasingly faced an opponent that could hit it before a Soviet crew had time to close the distance to a favorable range. Under those conditions, the very logic of the engagement changed. The advantage shifted to whoever spotted the target first and opened accurate fire from long range. The difference was felt not only in individual engagements, but also in the broader perception of frontline armor. If in 1941 the KV could seem like an almost invulnerable roadblock, the arrival of the Tigers quickly began to shatter that image. The heavy tank that had recently caused confusion and hesitation on the enemy side now found itself in the position of a vehicle forced to fight more cautiously and seek more favorable conditions. A characteristic example of this turning point is often cited in connection with fighting near Leningrad. On February 12, 1943, 3 Tigers knocked out 10 KVs without suffering losses of their own. This episode is not important because it fully represents every clash between such vehicles, but because it very clearly illustrates a change of era. The KV was no longer the heavy tank that set the rules of combat in its class. It was now facing equipment that surpassed it in range and effectiveness of fire. At that moment, what had previously only been taking shape became fully clear. KV modernization efforts improved certain qualities, but they could not restore the vehicle's former technological edge. The war was moving on, requirements were rising, anti-tank capabilities were growing, and a heavy tank designed for the early phase of the conflict no longer matched the new stage of combat the way it had at the beginning. That did not mean the KV vanished from the front overnight. These tanks continued to be used, and their crews could still solve difficult battlefield tasks under specific conditions. But the KV's role was beginning to change. It was gradually ceasing to be the Soviet Union's main bet in heavy tank development, and was increasingly seen as an important but transitional stage. A machine that contributed a great deal, but whose time in the spotlight was nearing its end. After the Tiger appeared, the KV did not disappear from the battlefield overnight. In real war, equipment rarely leaves the stage in a single day. It continues to be used where it can still be useful, where there are trained crews, spare parts, established logistics, and familiar tactical methods. That is exactly how the KV's later fate unfolded. It was gradually stepping back from the role of the main heavy tank, but it still remained part of frontline operations. From mid-1943 onward, these tanks were seen less and less often, and most commonly on the Leningrad front. This was no longer the period when the KV was viewed as a universal answer to the toughest sectors of the battlefield. Its use was becoming more limited and more dependent on specific circumstances. Where it had once been considered one of the main assets, it now increasingly became a vehicle employed with careful attention to its strengths, but without the same expectations as before. And yet, even at this stage, the KV remained important. The reason was not only that a heavily armored tank could still be useful in certain roles. More importantly, by this point, the KV had already played a crucial part as a foundation for further development. Behind it stood accumulated combat experience, technical solutions, and a clearer understanding of what worked in a heavy tank and what needed to be reconsidered. In that sense, its significance did not decline, simply because fewer KVs were at the front. It was taking on a different form. That is why the KV's withdrawal from the leading role should not be seen as a simple abandonment of a failed concept. On the contrary, it was a natural stage of development. The war was rapidly changing the requirements for heavy tanks. Effective engagement ranges were increasing, anti-tank artillery was becoming stronger, and demands for mobility, reliability, and coordination with other branches were rising. A machine that had been very strong in one phase of the war required replacement in the next, not because it had become useless, but because the front had moved on. Against this background, the transition to the new IS series heavy tanks did not look like a sharp break, but like a logical continuation of accumulated experience. Industry and the Army were shifting to vehicles better suited to the new reality. But that transition was made possible in large part by the path the KV had already gone through. It gave designers and military planners practical lessons that could never be gained from calculations and rear area testing alone. So, the KV gradually left the front line, but it did not disappear from the history of the war. Its role changed. From the main heavy tank of the early period, it became an essential link in the chain of Soviet armored development. And the further the front moved away from the first months of the war, the clearer it became that the KV's significance was defined not only by its own battles, but also by what it left behind, in metal, in tactics, and in the very logic of heavy tank development. It is precisely this legacy that makes the story of the KV far broader than the fate of a single tank model at the front. Even after the KV itself began appearing less often in combat reports, its design platform continued to serve the war effort. New vehicles were built on its chassis, including heavy self-propelled guns, and the most famous example was the Su-152, a machine that inherited from the KV platform both structural strength and the ability to carry a powerful weapon. That is the KV's greatest significance for Soviet tank development. It did not simply appear at the right time, and it did not merely prove itself in the hardest months of the war. It became a transitional vehicle in the most important sense of the word. Through it, the Army and industry passed a stage without which they could not have moved quickly to the next level. The KV provided not only combat experience, but also a clear understanding of the price of every design choice: armor thickness, weight, mobility, reliability, ease of control, and production feasibility. Its path was contradictory, and that is exactly why it matters so much. On the one hand, it was a tank that, early in the war, could become an almost insurmountable obstacle and force the enemy to urgently look for unconventional ways to fight it. On the other hand, it was a vehicle whose technical and operational limitations too often prevented its full potential from being realized. It was formidable, but difficult to sustain in frontline everyday conditions. Advanced in protection, but far from free of weaknesses. Extremely powerful in its time, yet dependent on how quickly the war itself was changing. And yet, those are often the machines that leave the deepest mark. Not the perfect ones, not the universal ones, not the eternal ones, but the ones that change the direction of technological development at a critical moment. For the Red Army, the KV became the first mass-produced heavy tank with shell-resistant armor. For the enemy, it was an early warning that familiar anti-tank solutions no longer worked as reliably as before. That is why the end of the KV's story is not simply a retreat from the spotlight. It is a transition into the status of a machine that outlived its main combat role and remained in history as an essential stage in a much larger evolution. The few surviving examples in museums today are seen not only as rare pieces of military hardware, but also as reminders of a period when a heavy tank appeared on the battlefield and, for a time, changed the very feel of facing armored steel.